Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. You're welcome to this episode of Sharia Intelligence, where we will carry on the subject of Islamic legal maxims or Islamic legal philosophy, Qawaid al-Fiqhiyah. I am your host, Muhammad Nuruddin Lemu, and with me to discuss today's topic are two of our distinguished facilitators, volunteers with the Da'wah Institute, Sister Salatu Suleh and Brother Nasir Bello. You are both most welcome.
Thank you.
Today we will be looking at the third of the universal maxims in the order in which we have arranged these. The one that deals with removing harm, ad-darar yuzal, that harm must be eliminated. I'd like to start with Brother Nasir. What does this maxim actually mean? What's it out to promote? What's it there to protect? Why is it so important?
Ad-darar yuzal is the third maxim based on the usually how scholars present them. Harm must be eliminated. It's a priority setting maxim. It puts the magnifying glass on harm. That harm in whatever form, shape or dimension should be prevented or cured. Harm to all maqasid, for example, it's about preventing the state of darura and haja. How do you ensure you are able to prevent harm on life, on religion, on wealth, on dignity, and all other relevant and important things that maqasid is out there to promote and protect. It's a maxim that emphasized on the idea of preventing harm, or what we call an-nahi anil munkar, is an indirect way of promoting and protecting good or maslaha. Ad-darar yuzal is a maxim that tries to accord priority to the challenging issues faced by a victim, challenges of injustice, of oppression, and what have you. So this is a very important maxim when it comes to preventing harm and giving priority to preventing harm and seeing it within the context of promoting benefit. So it is the opposite of what we call jalbul masalih, that is dar'ul mafasid, trying to prevent anything that will be harmful, because preventing something that is harmful is in a way promoting benefit.
Interesting. Sister Salah, what would you add, please?
Yeah, when we look at the maxim, ad-darar yuzal, and it simply states that harm must be removed, eliminated, prevented. It implies, therefore, that harm should be identified, that one should go out of one's way to ascertain what is causing the harm, what could prevent or stop it. So it follows through with striving, making an effort to actually make sure the harm is either prevented or stopped. If we connect it to the first maxim we discussed, al-umuru bima qasidiha, that where you are required to say, okay, if every matter, al-umur, will be assessed based on their purposes, bima qasidiha, it therefore implies that one would consider carefully before taking an action, before making a policy, will this lead to benefit or harm? So there's an implied obligation beyond just when I become aware of this harm, I will do something to remove it or to prevent it. It's beyond that. It implies go out of your way to understand the situation. There is a habit among some Muslims that when maybe there's a problem, especially where the problem seems intractable or seems to be very complex, or they cannot immediately find a way to solve it, then they might fall back on qadr Allah, Allah's will, Allah's decree. Yes, as Muslims, we believe in Allah's decree, but it would be quite odd to say that we know Allah's decree. I think one can only say we know Allah's decree in hindsight. After a matter has passed, it's over, it's done with, then you can say now we know that was Allah's decree because He caused it to reach that point. But if one sees something that's causing harm, one cannot fall back on, oh, it's Allah's decree, let it be, that is how it is. Because here, as we mentioned in the beginning, those maxims are rooted in numerous mutawatir verses of the Quran and ahadith. Therefore, it's not about escaping responsibility, but this particular maxim, ad-darar yuzal, harm must be eliminated, says we have a deep responsibility to prevent harm or remove it when it's occurring around us. And it could be harm to oneself, it could be harm to another human being, or harm to animals, or even harm to the environment, those inanimate things. And one might say, okay, yes, you get making an effort to prevent harm to oneself or other human beings or even animals, but trees and the sea and the river, what does religion have to do with that? The point is that if Allah says to us that the entire earth has been subjected to us for our use, then the earth is our rizq, the provision He has given us. And Allah does not want us wasting anything. So harm to a tree, or harm to the rivers, or harm to rocks and mountains is ultimately harm to ourselves. So ad-darar yuzal has this really broad application, and it's very similar in function to the safety net principles, istidlal, that is istihsan, juristic preference, maslaha, public benefit, and swadudariya, the blocking of the means to the harm. And here again we see that intersection we keep talking about between al-qawaidu fiqhiyya, that is the maxims of Islamic jurisprudence, and usulul fiqh, the science of Islamic jurisprudence or Islamic law.
I like the way you emphasize that this maxim ad-darar yuzal, and you touched on it in all dimensions, not just harm to people, but even harm to the environment. Because it is this environment that is part of the legacy that we leave behind. You actually find intergenerational justice issues where one generation does injustice to another. And as Muslims, خَيْرًا يَرَى or شَرًا يَرَى, whoever does an atom's weight of good or bad will see it. So the need for us to really do what we can to prevent all and cure all forms of harm to the best of our ability. Picking on the last couple of points that you made to do with the evidence for this already supported in usul, in other words, what we find, as you've mentioned, that saddu zariya, maslaha, istihsan and co are used by scholars to remove harm, to prevent rulings from causing harm. What would you say are the forms of evidence in addition to these? What are the kinds of proofs presented to justify the authority of this maxim?
Okay, let's start directly from the Quran. We have verses that, when put together, give support to ad-darar yuzal. One of such verses is the verse that tells us that we should not lend our hands or stretch our hands or put our hands to our own destruction. The way the verse is saying is, do not contribute to your own destruction. That's one. There's another one where Allah was mentioning that, the same law that has been given to us and to other communities is that, or like that which was given to the people of Israel, which is, if you save a life, it's as if you've saved all of humanity. So there's this idea that killing one person is like killing entire humanity. Saving one, saving entire humanity. Embedded in that is the idea, don't cause harm. Save, don't kill, which ties us to that central overarching goal of Islamic principles, which is prevent harm and bring forth benefit. Another example from the Quran, again, is where it said that no mother will be harmed because of her child, and no father will be harmed because of his child. The important point to note in this particular verse is the fact that we are made to understand that as close as the parent-child relationship might be, there should not be a situation where a parent is made to carry the blame for something that the child has done. And we also see in other verses where it's also vice versa. The child should not be brought to harm because of something the parent has done. So this make very clear lines between people, despite relationships and all of that. No harm. Another one, I think, let me add one more, is where Allah talks about men should not insist on keeping their wives or refuse to give the wives a divorce in order to harm the wives. In order to harm the wives. So here we also see that same idea of what's the intent behind this. Because sometimes you might see a marriage is breaking down, it's crumbling, the woman wants a divorce, and the husband is saying no, no, no. Now the intent for the husband at that time might be, let's go for more counseling, let's seek reconciliation. Or you've said ABC about me, okay, let me try and fix that, let's see if it will work. Or I'm actually thinking of our children. Can we hold on? Can we think of a different outcome? So that purpose, that intent is positive. But here Allah is warning those whose purpose is really just out of spite. Do not cause this harm. Don't do this. When we look at these verses and so many others together, we understand, and we can frame it any way we want, that the purpose of the lawgiver himself, the author of the Quran, Allah, is to prevent harm. And he has put that duty upon us as well, because we are his khalaifa. We are his representatives on earth. We are the ones who, as you mentioned, we've inherited the earth and we've inherited these things. And he has given us, therefore, the responsibility for preventing harm. By going, aligning ourselves, our choices, our judgments, if we are judges, our rulings, if we are muftis or mujtahid, our decisions or policies, if we are policy makers, by aligning them with this maxim, ad-darar yuzal, we are actually maintaining the purpose and the spirit of Islam. Even if what we are operating is not an Islamic organization or an Islamic entity, it's not faith-based. But we find this same thing, as we'll discuss later. This same, it's common sense, really. It's at play even in among people who are not religious, who even say God doesn't exist. I often feel that when one looks at the maxims, personally for me, they help me find my common sense. So that's what I would like to add to that.
Thank you. Anna Nasser, what would you add to the justification authority of these maxims?
You would find a lot of prophetic ahadith, traditions, regarding this issue of you shouldn't cause, inflict, and even reciprocate harm. La darara wa la dirara. And you will also find a hadith where Rasulullah says, whenever you see, whoever sees something that is wrong, you should make every effort necessary to try to prevent it or stop it. Either using your hand or using your mouth, or trying to abstain from it or hate it or dislike it with your own heart. He said, من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطع فبلسانه فإن لم يستطع فبقلبه وذلك أضعاف الإيمان. And other traditions where Rasulullah talked about finding cure to problems, to diseases. And in fact, the Quran itself was referred to as cure or shifa. Shifa to the disease of the heart, to the disease of the society, because it's a guide people from being, falling into something that is going to harm them. And if you look at the genesis or the reason for even sending prophet as explained by the Quran, it's also about preventing harm, because it speaks to the idea of people being united, and somehow they get distracted and they begin to become so divided and fragmented, and that create chaos amongst them. And then Allah will send messengers to guide them again. Where Allah says, كان الناس أمة واحدة فبعث الله النبيين مبشرين ومنذرين وأنزل معهم الكتاب بالحق ليحكم بين الناس فيما اختلفوا فيه. That people were united, they were one. Then they begin to divide. Scholars usually used to imply كان الناس أمة واحدة فاختلفوا, and they got divided, they got distracted, they are falling into harm, creating problem. Then Allah sent messengers over time. So usually if people are guided and then messengers come and go, and then they go back to finding themselves in a harmful way, Allah will then send another messenger that will guide them. So that has been the sunnah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, trying to help, trying to prevent harm, the humanity or the entire world from falling into harm. Another very important hadith of the Prophet is that which talks about trust, that you should fulfill trust and you shouldn't deceive others. In fact, you shouldn't even deceive somebody who deceived you. So if you look at this maxim of ad-darar yuzal, you realize, like other maxims discussed earlier, it in the wordings it might appear as solitary, but because of the the quantum evidence that are backing and supporting it, scholars will always look at it as in terms of meaning, it has reached the level of tawatur, that it gets the level of yaqeen. Remembering the statement made by Shatibi, that if you can think about anything closer to mutawatir, these are the maxims that we are talking about. Another important thing is the statement of Al-Iz ibn Abdul Salam. Al-Iz ibn Abdul Salam said, if you study the purpose of Sharia, particularly regarding issues of bringing benefit and good and preventing harm, you can undoubtedly conclude that it is unlawful to overlook anything good and of course support anything that is harmful on even specific issues. You don't need any specific text of the Quran or any ijma of scholars or any qiyas, looking at the overall objective and how Islamic law or Sharia generally emphasize on the importance and gives priority on this idea of bringing benefit and preventing harm.
Thank you very much. And it reminds one of a statement by Abdullah bin Abbas that every time the Quran tells you, any time the Quran or Allah says, don't do this, it is to prevent harm. In other words, all the prohibitions are there to protect against certain mafasid or harms. The Prophet, as you've implied, prophets throughout history were sent as rahmah to their communities, or the Prophet sent as a rahmah lil alameen. And I like, just looking at the various forms of evidence, reiterating again the points that you made earlier, that it's to prevent bodily harm, prevent psychological harm to parents, family level, harm to environment, harm to political systems, harm to social cohesion, moral harm, any form of harm. And you concluded with Al-Iz bin Abdul Salam's statement that you don't need text. We've got enough text to understand that harm must be eliminated. The moment something is harmful, it is creating damage, it's corrupting something good, we should do all we can to prevent and cure it. But taking on that, as with the other universal maxims, most of these maxims have children. They have sub-maxims that help us understand the mother maxim, if I put it that way. Could you give some examples of these other maxims that are related to ad-darar yuzal?
There are a lot of maxims, sub-maxims that you can find under this very important and universal maxim of ad-darar yuzal. For example, there is this maxim that al-aslu ma dar al-haram, that anything that is harmful, the norm is it is prohibited.
The asl, the legal
asl,
presumption.
Yeah, the legal presumption, the original position, the default position on anything that is harmful is that it's haram. And another important maxim is al-aslu fi dima al-haram, that anything that has to do with blood, that is harming somebody to the extent of removing blood, is
or loss of life or injury.
Loss of life. So things around violent extremism, for example, anything that will affect the livelihood of people, that will injure them or will harm them or will kill them, is considered to be haram.
So like just violence?
Violence,
default.
Any form of violence in Islam, the default position is that it is prohibited. Another important maxim is that harm is prevented or protected to the best way, in the best way possible. That is, yudahamul darar بقدر الإمكان, that at whatever level you do your best to see that you are able to prevent ضرر, that is anything that is harmful. And another important maxim or sub-maxim is that you are not going to, or you are not expected to displace or to remove harm with another harm. You don't remove harm with another harm. الضرر لا يزال بالضرر. That harm will not be removed by another thing that is harmful.
Similar harm.
Exactly, similar harm. But again, another important maxim is that sometimes harm that is lesser or specific can be tolerated in order to prevent harm that is general or something that is bigger. So it's another important maxim that usually scholars looked at. Basically, the idea of harm, like I said at the beginning, if you look at all these sub-maxims, what they are saying is that harm in whatever form, shape or dimension should be avoided. Harm to human beings, harm to animal, harm to the environment, harm that is actually demonstrated or discharged by somebody that is stronger to a weaker person, and vice versa. In every form, it has to be avoided, it has to be eliminated.
Wonderful. And I think in our societies, there's no lack of harm going on. There's no lack of suffering in nearly every profession. You would find there's a harm that people are trying to remove, and a lot of work, I think, for all of us. Yeah. Sister Salah, what could you add to other maxims related to this one?
Okay, let me touch on the last sub-maxim that Brother Nasir mentioned, which is that greater harm can be removed by lesser harm. That sub-maxim provides sort of an exception to the what we will call the parent maxim, Adora Yuzal, because you have those situations where the only options open to someone in a situation, both are harmful. This sub-maxim, that is Yuzal Adora Ashadu Bidora Al Khaf, is saying when you have those two options, weigh both. Is there one of the kinds of harm that will be caused that is lesser than the other? If these are your only alternatives, then go for the lesser harm. I think an example many of us will understand and can identify with is, let's say, for instance, someone has a surgical operation that the doctor thinks they should take. For instance, someone was hit by shrapnel. The doctor will actually weigh the harm to be caused, that could be caused or would be caused by the surgery itself, because every surgical procedure causes harm. There are the complications that arise from it, there's the post-operative issues that come from it. The doctor will weigh that against going after the piece of shrapnel. And there are many cases where the doctor then decide, or the doctors consult and decide, you know what? The harm we will cause trying to get out the shrapnel is greater than the harm that will be caused by leaving the shrapnel in this person's body, maybe for another month or a year or even for a lifetime. So they make those kinds of decisions because it has to be one or the other. Now, another sub-maxim that we can look at that is connected to Adwara Yuzal is the one that says, that necessity permits the unlawful. Adwara, that's that situation where you are in a position where harm is being caused to you, would then make it permissible that something that was ordinarily unlawful becomes lawful. And we can use the same idea of surgery, taking a knife to somebody's body, cutting it open, or cutting off a part of someone's limb. If I say just like this, we would say that's harm. It shouldn't happen. But when you look at this context, it's now made permissible because you are looking to reduce or remove harm. Another one is when we say remove harm, and the idea is that do something to reduce the harm that's being caused. There's this maxim that says that whatever action you are going to take should be proportional to that situation. When you are saying it's out of necessity that we are doing this, this necessity that one is talking about, whatever step you are taking should be commensurate with that. You shouldn't exceed that. Permission should therefore be given only in relation to what will remove the harm. And so some of these sub-maxims that I've mentioned, in fact, the three of them, they kind of work together. So when we when we just started talking about al-qawaid and saying you don't, scholars do not take a maxim in isolation. They take the maxim, they look at the other core maxims, they look at the sub-maxims as well. And it is all of this working together that helps them balance what should be done. When we then look at our society and look at what decisions are made, what fatwas are given based on this concept, we see fatwas related to copyrights and patents and intellectual property rights, where there have been debates sometimes where some Muslims come from the point of view of that knowledge is a lost property of every Muslim. Why would you want to have a law that says I can't use your work unless I have your permission, I can't reproduce it unless this, unless that? The harm that would arise from giving that sort of freedom would include things like then people would not be driven to invent anything. They would not be motivated to do research or to put in effort, because then everybody will just sit and wait for the, for the fool who's going to do it, and then they just copy the person's work. So fatwas have been given that this is permissible. It is in line with Islam, because the harm that would result from that is greater. People will not do research. They would not go out of their way, because research and all of these things require pouring in effort as well as money and time. Another way we see this at work is when governments then try to restrict things such as the age of marriage, setting a minimum age of marriage. People protest that sometimes, saying, why would you tell me that my child cannot get married until this age? Why would you say my child must go to school? The fatwas given in support of that, the government who have gone ahead to set minimum age for marriage, to make education compulsory, they are looking at the long-term effect when people don't get an education, when young girls, their education is truncated because they are going to get married. Of course, one can say yes, but people who give off their daughters early in marriage or who do not go to school, many of them are not doing it willfully. It's the economic circumstances that have forced them into this situation, which goes back to what we said in the beginning, ad-darar yuzal. If there is harm, it's not enough to say we'll do A, set a minimum age for marriage, make education compulsory, and then we stop there. No, we just keep digging. Is there still harm? Has the harm been eliminated? Will it now be prevented? And you have to do much more, which is improve what's going on in the society, improve infrastructure, improve living standards, and so on and so forth.
This is.
I think these very important maxims, like you can find with others, are very important, particularly on the area of governance and societal development and societal transformation. Now, if you look at this example of the maxim, the sub-maxim that talks about trying to prevent harm to the best of your ability, it deals with addressing socio-economic issues, things around poverty, things around homelessness, and what have you, and how governments, communities, organizations are expected to try their own best to address these problems. And if you look at the other maxim, which talks about accommodating يتحمل الضرر أخص لدفع الضرر عام, where you accommodate or tolerate specific harms in order to avert or to prevent something that is more general. It's a typical case of what Uthman ibn Affan did, banning the riwayah shadha after the compilation of the Quran and the standardization, which led to the development of the non-Nuskha Uthmani. Uthman ibn Affan banned some of this that would create a problem or confusion with the one that actually was unanimously accepted and standardized by the companions. And I think another practical case that is related or that demonstrate the application of this particular sub-maxim is this case of COVID-19, where scholars issued fatwa on spacing, social distancing, and even at some point stopping people from going for congregational prayer. So this is a specific problem, but if you look at the bigger implication that this is trying to avert, then you will appreciate the relevance and importance of this particular maxim.
Good. And as you've already, related it to things in usul, it is this kind of darar or harm, either to an individual or society facing haja, that is treated as serious as a darura, where society is facing economic difficulty, food shortages, and you've mentioned how laws are relaxed for these places. Certain things are restricted, taqid al-mubah, which we discussed in the discussions on Saddu Zariya, how the tools of maslaha, the tools of Saddu Zariya, the tools of Fathu Zariya, of permitting what is usually prohibited or prohibiting what is usually permitted, as in Saddu Zariya, are used by scholars to try and prevent harm.
Yeah.
And we will see, I think, the second part of this maxim later, or related, the mashakka tajlibu taysir. But before we move on to that, Nasir, could you share with us some examples of the application of this maxim in everyday life or in the concerns of scholars?
Well, there are lots of examples actually you can find because of the
You've
nature.
even started with
Exactly,
the COVID.
Exactly, the
Yeah.
issue of COVID, where scholars will look at the harm and then issue a fatwa that will actually resolve the problem. Just like you would find a situation where it was prohibited for somebody to take laws into his hands, trying to revenge something that has been done to you. Maybe somebody offended you or killed some of your relatives, and this idea of vendetta, Islam is against it. The general idea of jungle justice, because of the greater harm that it could cause the society. Or for example, the penalties that actually put in place on issues that are provisions of preventing harm to others, such as traffic rules, where because of the maslaha of the ummah, there should be order as to how people govern their affairs. And therefore, if you violate that and you are allowed, that will create a greater harm. So that is why you find societies trying to put in this. It's within the spirit of this very important maxim of ad-dararu yuzal.
Sister Salah, what would you add as examples?
Okay. One example that we can look at is this whole idea of hate speech. When we sometimes have situations where people utter words that promote hatred of a particular group of people, and there are those who say that should be controlled, that should be restricted. Others then come forward and say, well, what about freedom of speech? People are just expressing their freedom of speech. When we hold up the framework of Adwara Yuzal and everything else that comes with it, the question would be, this particular thing that is being said, is it likely to lead to harm? What is the harm that comes with it? Is there any benefit in it even? Because when you have, if you look at places where genocide has occurred, they typically start with just words, just speech. Rwanda is an example. Started with just calling a particular tribe, the Tutsis, cockroaches. That word that seems to be just a regular insult, the kind where, if I remember what used to happen growing up in those days, somebody insults you, you go crying to your mom or someone older than you, they say, don't you have a mouth? Insult them in return. That word that seems to be just an insult, it's not just an insult, it's dehumanizing. And once people no longer look like people in the eyes of others, then other forms of harm come into play. So hate speech makes it easier for human beings to harm one another, whether the harm is psychological, emotional, financial, or even physical, injury plus loss of life. It's therefore important that when we look at our communities, we look at the words people utter, and if the words cause harm in and of themselves in the present, or they may cause harm going forward, then we should prevent those. I would like to connect this to that hadith where the Prophet ﷺ was sitting with Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. Someone came insulted Abu Bakr. Abu Bakr ignored him, insulted him a second time, ignored him a third time. Abu Bakr then responded. And the Prophet ﷺ stood up and was leaving. And Abu Bakr was surprised and he asked him, Ya Rasulullah, are you angry with me? He said, no, I'm not angry with you. But before you responded to this person, an angel was giving the lie to what this person was saying. In other words, responding on your behalf. When you replied, Shaitan came and sat down. Now the question would be, even if we can't see Shaitan, even if we want to treat that incident as allegorical, what is the lesson there? We all know that one of the things Shaitan loves is enmity and friction and trouble and chaos. So if we take that as just a symbol, symbolically said, what is the symbol? The symbol is once hate speech, words of insult start to fly, it cannot get better, it only gets worse. So the lesson is, first you stop the progression by not responding in kind, then you go further and actually stop those words from coming out. That's one. Then the removing of the harm caused by extremism of any kind, including, but maybe especially religious extremism, especially Muslim extremists. I will not say Islamic extremists, there's no such thing in my dictionary. That is a true oxymoron. But when Muslims are extreme in their views, extreme in their actions, they are going against a core tenet of Islam that is embodied by Adora Yuzal. We can look at some other aspect, which is now more preventing harm by doing research, undertaking research work, by setting up institutes that look at financial auditing, that look at data analysis, data collation and analysis, so that people can understand the trends going on in the society, Bureau of Statistics, making sure these things function. Because what such offices or institutes, what they do is to try to act before a problem occurs. By watching the trends in population, trends in food production and consumption, trends in sales, in commerce, or in a particular industry, they can tell ahead of time that if this trend continues for the next month, the next 2 years, we will have a problem. We will have food shortage, we will have this, we will have that. So those things are necessary. As we said in the very beginning, Adora Yuzal saying eliminate or prevent implies dig deeper, investigate, identify, preempt. And setting up institutes like this actually help to do this.
I think this ties in with the maxim we discussed last time of al-yaqin la yazulu bi-shak.
Yes.
You know, this issue of certainty of harm and being able to measure harm. And when you're going to choose a lesser evil, that you have a level of certainty that this is actually lesser than the other.
Yes.
And you know, the environmentalist in me is speaking on the environmental education of people to make people more aware of the harm they cause subsequent generations, not just their generation, and not just the present generation, to find ways of supporting sustainable development goals. Because sustainable development is really about how one generation can meet its needs without undermining the ability and compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So, you know, this issue of being more environmentally sensitive, because nearly everything we do in life is on the environment. The environment is the canvas on which our economic life, our social life, and if we allow that to degrade, then we move into situations in movies where people need to move to other planets, God forbid, because we've just made Earth a dumping ground for every form of pollution.
I'm sorry, just to chip in there, even in those movies where they move to other planets, I think I saw one such movie recently. I was like, but the people who actually were able to go to that planet were the most troublesome ones here. So they just export the trouble with them.
This is very true. And so I think, as you've already mentioned, Ad-Darar Yuzal deals with harm to any and every. And we look at the harm caused to animals in factory farming, in agriculture, and how some of us unfortunately support the cruelty to layer chickens who are put in these small battery cages And they can't even flap their wings. They suffer from cage fatigue. Now, that's actually a psychological depression that chickens go through, and they can't lay eggs anymore. They have to be let out for a while. You know, it's like solitary confinement in a sense. So this kind of removing of harm, the promotion of free range, more organic forms of agriculture that are less harmful, but also looking at the design of our abattoirs, where animals are killed and how they are killed, to ensure that the minimum amount of harm or hurt is caused to animals. And it is along those lines that we find fatwas on the permissibility of electrocution to stun an animal, not to kill it, but at least it is unconscious. And you know, we find ways of minimizing, realizing that maqasid and objective of removing as much harm or hurt to the animal as possible. The fatwas that permit security men to stay on guard while Jummah prayers are going, so they don't join the prayers for security. And here you would say, but it's some form of small harm to them, but it is to prevent a greater harm of extremism, etc. The same maxim you find being applied to family life. Family is one of the most important units of society. So the importance of premarital counseling, of marital counseling, of protecting children from dysfunctional families. One study was even saying, this is a person who was studying serial killers, one of the most respected scholars in the study of serial killers, and he was saying he has not come across this one serial killer that didn't come from a dysfunctional family. You know, so you know, when we have problems in our society, we need to ask ourselves, where are these people coming from who really have no compassion, and how can we help prevent some of these? The methods or alternatives to violence in dealing with problems. Some just feel we're stuck in this political, social, economic, corrupt system. We need a revolution. And you know, as you've already mentioned, any form of harm is by default haram, unless we can have absolutely no alternative and it is worth it and justified. But this is where peaceful demonstrations, various ways of petitioning, peace rallies, in some contexts, yes, they will cause inconvenience to traffic and all of that, but the need to weigh and not be quick to judge that, you know, this is haram or this is halal, but to recognize you need to weigh the greater, the lesser evil, but we must find realistic alternatives to violence in dealing with grievances. I'd like to thank you both for your contributions in elucidating and explaining this maxim, ad-darar yuzal. Inshallah, we will then move to the next maxim next time. For now, jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you very much for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.